In the spring of 1841, in Mobile County, Alabama, something happened that challenged every social boundary the antebellum South had constructed. A wealthy widow named Elizabeth Hartwell, an enslaved man named Isaiah who'd managed her estate for years, and a decision that violated the most fundamental rule of Southern society, that the lines between white and black, free and enslaved, could never be crossed. If stories about impossible choices matter to you, about what happens when gratitude and loneliness collide with an inhumane system, then stay with me. Because what Elizabeth Hartwell did in 1841 tells you everything you need to know about the contradictions at the heart of slavery, and why some acts of recognition, however well-intentioned, could never escape the evil of the system that made them necessary. The year 1841 sits in the heart of the antebellum period, when cotton made Alabama one of the wealthiest states in America. Mobile was a major port, shipping cotton to markets around the world, creating fortunes for plantation owners while grinding enslaved people into early graves. The social structure was rigid. White people held all power. Black people, enslaved or free, were considered inferior by law and custom, and the most sacred boundary of all was between white women and black men. Protecting white women from any hint of improper association with black men was seen as essential to maintaining social order. Elizabeth Hartwell was born Elizabeth Monroe in 1795, daughter of a prominent Mobile merchant family. She married Jonathan Hartwell in 1815, when she was 20 and he was 35. Jonathan owned Rosewood Plantation, 2,800 acres, 75 enslaved people, highly profitable cotton production. The marriage was happy by the standards of the time. Jonathan was a capable planter, Elizabeth a dutiful wife. They had 2 children, a son who died in infancy in 1818, and a daughter named Mary, who died of fever in 1822 at age 5. After Mary's death, Elizabeth couldn't have more children, which was seen as a personal tragedy in a society that measured women's worth partly by their ability to produce heirs. Jonathan died suddenly in October 1839 at age 64 from what the doctor called apoplexy, probably a stroke. His death left Elizabeth a 44-year-old widow with no children, no close family, and a massive plantation to manage. Under Alabama law, Elizabeth inherited everything: the land, the house, and the 75 enslaved people who worked Rosewood. She could have sold the plantation and moved to Mobile to live comfortably on the proceeds. Many widows did exactly that, preferring city life to the isolation and responsibility of plantation management. But Elizabeth decided to stay at Rosewood. It was her home. She'd lived there for 24 years. Selling it would mean admitting defeat, giving up the life she'd built with Jonathan. The problem was that Elizabeth knew almost nothing about actually running a plantation. Jonathan had managed everything: the planting decisions, the labor management, the financial arrangements. Elizabeth had managed the household, supervised domestic slaves, handled social obligations. The business side of the plantation was completely foreign to her. This is where Isaiah becomes central to the story. Isaiah was born around 1805 on a Virginia plantation. He'd been sold south in the 1820s, purchased by Jonathan Hartwell in 1828. By 1841, Isaiah was 36 years old and had spent 13 years at Rosewood. Isaiah was what plantation owners called exceptionally capable. He could read and write. Jonathan had taught him, recognizing his intelligence and needing someone literate to help manage plantation records. He understood cotton cultivation, crop rotation, market timing. He could manage other enslaved workers effectively, earning their respect rather than just their fear. By the mid-1830s, Jonathan had essentially made Isaiah his plantation manager. Isaiah would oversee the daily operations, make decisions about planting and harvesting, keep the financial records. Jonathan still maintained ultimate authority, but Isaiah did most of the actual work of running Rosewood. When Jonathan died in 1839, Isaiah was the only person at Rosewood who truly understood how everything worked. Elizabeth recognized this immediately. Within days of Jonathan's funeral, she met with Isaiah to discuss the plantation's operations. "Isaiah, I'm going to be honest with you," Elizabeth said. "I don't know how to run this plantation. My husband managed everything, and I paid almost no attention to the business side. Without your help, Rosewood will fail." Isaiah listened carefully. He understood that Elizabeth was admitting dependence on an enslaved person, which was unusual for white owners to acknowledge openly. "What do you need from me, Mistress Hartwell?" "I need you to continue doing what you did for my husband. Manage the operations, make the decisions about planting and harvesting, handle the finances. I'll sign whatever documents need signing. I'll represent Rosewood in dealings with merchants and other planters. But the actual running of the plantation, that will be your responsibility." Isaiah understood what she was asking. She wanted him to run Rosewood while she provided the respectable white face the business world required. It was an unusual arrangement, but not unprecedented. Some plantations were effectively managed by enslaved people or free black overseers, though the fiction was always maintained that white owners were in control. "I can do that," Isaiah said, "but I need you to trust my judgment. If I say we need to plant certain fields or hold cotton back from market, you have to support those decisions even if other planters question them. I'll trust your judgment. You know more about this than I do, and I'm not too proud to admit it." So began an arrangement that would last nearly 2 years. Isaiah managed Rosewood's operations, while Elizabeth handled the social and public aspects of ownership. Isaiah would brief Elizabeth on what was happening, explain decisions he'd made, prepare her to discuss plantation business with merchants and fellow planters. The arrangement worked remarkably well. The 1840 cotton crop was successful. The 1841 crop was even better. Rosewood remained profitable, Elizabeth's financial position secure. The enslaved workers at Rosewood, relatively well treated by the standards of the time. Isaiah had some influence over working conditions and used it to prevent the worst abuses. But something else was developing alongside the business relationship. Elizabeth and Isaiah were spending significant time together, hours each week, discussing plantation operations, reviewing financial records, planning for upcoming seasons. These conversations evolved beyond pure business. They'd discuss books. Isaiah would borrow volumes from the Rosewood Library, and they'd talk about what he'd read. They'd share observations about people and society. They developed a genuine intellectual connection. For Elizabeth, isolated as a childless widow in her mid-40s, Isaiah became her closest confidant. The white society in Mobile County treated her with sympathy, but also with a distance. She was no longer part of a couple, no longer quite fit the social expectations for women. She was lonely in ways that respectability prevented her from openly acknowledging. For Isaiah, the relationship with Elizabeth was complicated. She held absolute legal power over him, could sell him at any time, could punish him for any perceived insubordination. But she treated him with a respect he'd rarely experienced from white people. She valued his intelligence, trusted his judgment, seemed to see him as a person, rather than just property. By early 1841, their relationship had evolved into something that couldn't be easily categorized. Not quite friendship. The power imbalance prevented that. Not just business. There was genuine affection and intellectual connection. Something in between that had no acceptable place in Southern society. The incident that made everything more complicated happened in April 1841. Elizabeth became seriously ill with what the doctor diagnosed as influenza, complicated by exhaustion. She was bedridden for 3 weeks, feverish and weak, unable to manage even basic tasks. Isaiah took over completely during her illness. He ran the plantation, managed the household, made all decisions. But he also cared for Elizabeth personally, brought her food, administered medicine, sat with her during the worst of the fever, when she was delirious and frightened. There was nothing improper about this care. Isaiah remained entirely professional. But the intimacy of the situation, an enslaved man caring for a white woman in her most vulnerable state, violated unwritten rules about proper distance between white women and black men. When Elizabeth recovered in early May, she was deeply grateful. Isaiah had kept Rosewood running smoothly and had cared for her with a gentleness that moved her. "Thank you," she told him, when she was well enough to have a real conversation. "You could have let things fall apart while I was ill. You could have, I don't know, run away, taken advantage of the situation somehow. But you kept everything going, and you took care of me. I won't forget that." "You've treated me better than any owner I've had," Isaiah replied. "Given me responsibility, trusted my judgment, seen me as more than just property. Of course I'd take care of you." Elizabeth looked at Isaiah, this intelligent, capable, kind man who was technically her property, but felt like something else entirely. And she made a decision that would change everything. "Isaiah, I want to do something for you. Something to show my gratitude and recognition of what you've done. I know I can't change the basic reality that you're enslaved, but I can make your life better within that reality." "What do you mean?" "I'm going to give you your freedom." Isaiah stared at her, not quite believing what he'd heard. "Freedom?" "Yes. It will take some time to arrange legally. I'll need to file papers with the county, get approval from the court. But I'm going to manumit you. You'll be a free man." For Isaiah, this was almost incomprehensible. He'd been enslaved for 36 years. Freedom had been a distant dream, something that happened to other people, but never seemed attainable for him. And now Elizabeth was simply giving it to him? "I don't know what to say," Isaiah managed. "You don't need to say anything. You've earned this. You've managed Rosewood brilliantly. You've been loyal and trustworthy. You've treated me with kindness. If I can't free all 75 enslaved people here, which I can't, not without destroying myself financially, I can at least free you." Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth worked on the legal arrangements. Manumission, the legal freeing of enslaved people, was possible in Alabama in 1841, though it was becoming increasingly restricted. The law required court approval, proof that the enslaved person being freed wouldn't become a public burden, and usually a requirement that freed people leave the state within a certain time frame. Elizabeth prepared the paperwork meticulously. She'd need to demonstrate to the court that freeing Isaiah was justified, that he was of good character, that he had means to support himself as a free person. But as she worked on the manumission documents, Elizabeth made another decision, one that would prove far more controversial. She decided that simply freeing Isaiah wasn't enough reward for what he'd done. She wanted to ensure his financial security, wanted to give him real opportunities in freedom, rather than just the legal status. So Elizabeth did something extraordinary. She decided to deed him 100 acres of rosewood plantation. This was radical for multiple reasons. First, it would make Isaiah a landowner, extremely rare for free black people in Alabama. Second, it would give him significant wealth, as land was valuable. Third, it would make him Elizabeth's neighbor, a free black landowner living adjacent to her plantation. The legal complications were substantial. Alabama law in 1841 didn't explicitly prohibit white people from giving land to free black people, but it was so unusual that there was little precedent. Elizabeth would need court approval for both the manumission and the land transfer. She filed her petition with the Mobile County Court in June 1841. The petition explained that Isaiah had managed Rosewood with exceptional skill, had cared for her during serious illness, had demonstrated character and capability that justified both freedom and the land grant. The petition became public record, which meant the whole county soon knew what Elizabeth intended to do. The reaction was explosive. Fellow plantation owners were horrified. Freeing an enslaved person was barely acceptable. Giving that person land and wealth was seen as dangerous and irresponsible. They worried it would give other enslaved people ideas, would undermine the social order that kept slavery functioning. Elizabeth's few remaining friends tried to talk her out of it. They argued she was being foolish, that gratitude had made her irrational, that she'd regret giving away valuable land to someone who'd just been property weeks earlier. The Presbyterian minister who'd known Elizabeth for years came to Rosewood to discuss the situation. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand you feel grateful to Isaiah, but this action you're contemplating, it violates natural order. God created distinct races for distinct purposes. Elevating a Negro to land ownership contradicts divine will." Elizabeth responded with surprising force. "Reverend, I've read the Bible as carefully as you have. I find plenty about treating others as you'd want to be treated, about recognizing people's humanity regardless of station. I find very little supporting the idea that God intended some people to own others." The minister left unsatisfied, and Elizabeth's relationship with her church became strained. The county court scheduled a hearing for August 1841 to consider Elizabeth's petition. She would need to appear before the judge and explain why manumission and land transfer were justified. The hearing took place on August 15th, 1841. The courtroom was packed. This had become the scandal of Mobile County, and everyone wanted to witness what would happen. Elizabeth appeared with her lawyer, a man named Thomas Whitfield, who'd handled Jonathan's legal affairs. Isaiah was present, but couldn't testify. Enslaved people couldn't give testimony in court, and he wasn't yet legally free. The judge, a man named Samuel Porter, reviewed the petition carefully before addressing Elizabeth. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want to make sure I understand what you're requesting. You want to free this man Isaiah, and you want to give him 100 acres of prime cotton land. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Can you explain your reasoning?" Elizabeth had prepared her response carefully. "Your Honor, my late husband purchased Isaiah 13 years ago, recognizing his exceptional capabilities. Over those years, Isaiah learned to read and write, to manage complex plantation operations, to handle financial matters with skill. When my husband died, Isaiah stepped in to manage Rosewood, keeping it profitable when it could easily have failed. During my recent serious illness, Isaiah managed everything while also caring for me personally. He's demonstrated intelligence, loyalty, and character that deserve recognition." "And you believe the appropriate recognition is freedom plus significant land and wealth?" I believe that after 13 years of extraordinary service, during which Isaiah essentially ran this plantation, he's earned the opportunity to build his own life. The land I'm offering represents a small fraction of the wealth Isaiah has generated through his labor. If anything, I'm giving back far less than what his work has created." The judge frowned. "Mrs. Hartwell, some would say that this generosity stems from an inappropriate attachment to this enslaved man. That your judgment has been compromised by feelings that aren't proper between a white woman and a Negro man." Elizabeth understood what the judge was implying, that her relationship with Isaiah was somehow improper or romantic. The insinuation was offensive but predictable, given Southern society's obsession with protecting white women from any hint of association with black men. "Your Honor, my relationship with Isaiah is that of employer to employee, though the law calls it owner to property. He's managed my plantation, and I'm grateful. There's nothing inappropriate in recognizing excellent service." The judge consulted with the prosecutor and other court officials. After about 20 minutes, he returned his decision. "Mrs. Hartwell, the court will approve the manumission of Isaiah. The evidence suggests he's of good character and capable of supporting himself as a free man. However, the court cannot approve the land transfer." Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. "Why not, Your Honor?" "Because giving significant wealth to a newly freed Negro creates dangerous precedent. Other enslaved people might expect similar treatment. Free Negroes with wealth might develop aspirations above their proper station. The social order of Alabama depends on maintaining clear distinctions between white and colored, slave and free. What you're proposing blurs those distinctions in ways the court cannot sanction. So Isaiah will be free, but have nothing. Isaiah will be free, which is already generous. He can work for wages, accumulate his own resources over time. But the court will not facilitate his immediate elevation to landowner status." Elizabeth wanted to argue further, but recognized it was futile. The judge had made his ruling. Isaiah would be free. That much she'd accomplished. But her plan to give him real economic security had been blocked. The manumission was finalized in September 1841. Isaiah became legally free, one of only a few hundred free black people in Alabama. But he had no land, no significant resources, just his freedom and his skills. Under Alabama law, newly freed people were required to leave the state within a year, unless they obtained special permission to stay. Isaiah would need to either leave Alabama or get official approval to remain. Elizabeth immediately began trying to secure that permission. She filed petitions, called in favors with influential people, argued that Isaiah's skills were valuable to Alabama's economy. After 3 months of bureaucratic struggle, she finally obtained permission for Isaiah to remain in Alabama as a free person. But the question remained, what would Isaiah do now? He was free, but had no land, no business, no clear way forward. Elizabeth offered him a solution. She would hire him as her plantation manager. He'd receive a salary, making him one of the few black people in Alabama earning wages rather than working as enslaved labor. He'd continue doing essentially what he'd been doing, but now as a free person being compensated for his work. Isaiah accepted. What else could he do? He had skills in plantation management, but few other options. And despite the court's refusal to grant him land, Elizabeth was offering him something valuable: steady employment, fair wages, a chance to build savings. So Isaiah moved from the slave quarters to a small house Elizabeth had built for him on the edge of Rosewood property. He continued managing the plantation, now drawing a monthly salary that allowed him to slowly accumulate resources. The arrangement was unusual enough that it drew continued attention and criticism. Fellow planters thought Elizabeth was being foolish, paying wages to someone who'd previously worked for free. They worried about the precedent. If freed black people could earn good wages, it might make enslaved people more dissatisfied with their condition. Elizabeth ignored the criticism. She'd freed Isaiah. She was paying him fairly for his work, and Rosewood remained profitable. What others thought mattered less than doing what she felt was right. But the deeper question about the nature of Elizabeth's relationship with Isaiah never really went away. In the close-knit world of Mobile County society, people gossiped. There were whispers about why a widow would be so generous to a formerly enslaved man, about what their relationship really was. The whispers were fed by the fact that Elizabeth remained unmarried. She was still relatively young, 46 in 1841, and wealthy. She could have remarried, found another planter or businessman to share her life. Her refusal to even consider remarriage seemed suspicious to people looking for evidence of improper attachment to Isaiah. In truth, Elizabeth's feelings for Isaiah were complicated. She relied on him professionally, trusted him personally, enjoyed his company intellectually. Whether those feelings crossed into something romantic is impossible to know. Elizabeth never wrote explicitly about her inner emotional life, and Isaiah left no written record at all. What's clear is that their relationship violated social norms, not through any sexual impropriety. There's no evidence that ever occurred, but through the simple fact of mutual respect and intellectual partnership across the racial divide that slavery insisted must be absolute. The years following Isaiah's manumission were relatively stable. He managed Rosewood successfully through the mid-1840s. Elizabeth paid him consistently, and he saved diligently, building up modest but real wealth. By 1845, Isaiah had saved enough to purchase 20 acres of land, about 5 miles from Rosewood. Not the 100 acres Elizabeth had wanted to give him, but his own property nonetheless. Elizabeth helped him purchase the land, not through direct gift, but by offering advice and connecting him with a willing seller. It was as close as she could come to fulfilling her original intention without violating the court's ruling. Isaiah built a small house on his land and began cultivating it while continuing to manage Rosewood. He was becoming something rare in Alabama, a free black landowner with genuine economic independence. But in 1849, everything changed. Alabama passed new laws restricting free black people's rights. The laws prohibited free black people from entering the state and made it more difficult for those already present to maintain their status. There was talk of requiring all free black people to either choose enslavement or leave the state. Isaiah faced an impossible choice: accept re-enslavement or leave Alabama and the life he'd built over 8 years of freedom. Elizabeth tried to fight the new laws, filed protests, argued that Isaiah was a valuable member of the community who should be protected. But the political climate had shifted. Alabama was moving toward ever more rigid racial control, and free black people, especially successful ones like Isaiah, were seen as threats to the slave system. In early 1850, Isaiah made his decision. He would leave Alabama. He'd heard that Ohio was somewhat more hospitable to free black people, that communities existed there where he might be able to restart his life. Elizabeth was devastated. After all the years working together, after fighting for his freedom, and then fighting to let him stay, Isaiah was being forced out anyway. Before he left, Elizabeth did one final thing. She sold Isaiah's 20 acres for him, since he couldn't legally conduct the sale himself under the new restrictions, and added her own money to give him enough capital to establish himself in Ohio. "This isn't charity," Elizabeth told him as she prepared the bank draft. "This is the land I should have been allowed to give you 9 years ago, plus wages I should have paid you during all those years you worked enslaved. Consider it 8 years of back pay." Isaiah tried to protest that he'd been paid fairly since gaining freedom, but Elizabeth insisted, "You're leaving Alabama because the law is unjust. The least I can do is make sure you leave with resources to build a new life." Isaiah left Alabama in March 1850. He traveled to Cincinnati, used the capital Elizabeth had provided to purchase a small business, and gradually established himself in Ohio's free black community. Elizabeth remained at Rosewood, increasingly isolated. The Mobile County Society that had merely disapproved of her actions in 1841 had moved to something closer to ostracism by 1850. She'd violated too many unwritten rules: freeing an enslaved man, paying him wages, maintaining a relationship with him that seemed too equal, helping him leave Alabama with significant resources. Elizabeth managed Rosewood alone through the 1850s, hiring a white overseer to replace Isaiah's management skills. The plantation remained profitable, but Elizabeth had few social connections, few friends, lived quietly and alone. She died in 1862, at age 67. As the Civil War was destroying the plantation society she'd both participated in and quietly subverted. Her will freed all the remaining enslaved people at Rosewood, a manumission that would have been illegal, except that by 1862, Union forces were approaching Mobile, and the Confederate government's control over the region was collapsing. Isaiah learned of Elizabeth's death sometime in 1863 through letters that occasionally made their way between Ohio and Alabama. He was then 58 years old, had built a modest but stable life in Cincinnati, had never married. After the war ended and it was safe to travel, Isaiah returned to Alabama once, in 1867, to visit Rosewood. The plantation was in ruins, occupied by Union forces during the war, then abandoned, now overgrown and empty. Isaiah walked the land where he'd spent 13 years enslaved, and 8 years managing as a free man. He stood in what remained of the house where Elizabeth had lived, and he tried to make sense of what their relationship had meant. Elizabeth had been his owner, which made their relationship fundamentally exploitative, regardless of how she treated him. But she'd also freed him when she didn't have to, paid him fairly when most wouldn't, fought to let him remain in Alabama, and ensured he left with resources when forced out. Was she a slaveholder who deserved condemnation for participating in an evil system, or someone who'd tried, within that system's constraints, to recognize his humanity and provide opportunities? Isaiah concluded both were true. Elizabeth had been part of slavery, had owned him and others, had profited from their labor, had participated in a fundamentally immoral system. But she'd also tried, imperfectly and within limits, to treat him as a person rather than property. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem slavery. But it was something, an acknowledgement, however constrained by circumstance and law, that the system was wrong, and that the people trapped in it deserved better. Isaiah returned to Cincinnati after that visit, and never went back to Alabama. He died in 1872, at age 67, a free man who'd spent the last 22 years of his life outside slavery. The story of Elizabeth Hartwell and Isaiah reveals the contradictions at slavery's heart. Elizabeth couldn't escape being a slaveholder. She'd inherited that role, and her society offered no acceptable way to reject it completely. But she'd tried to soften slavery's edges, to treat Isaiah with respect, to recognize his humanity, however imperfectly the system allowed. The court's refusal to let her give Isaiah land shows how the system worked to prevent even generous impulses from threatening slavery's foundations. Elizabeth could free Isaiah. That relieved her of direct complicity in his enslavement. But she couldn't elevate him to real equality, couldn't give him wealth or status that might challenge racial hierarchy. And ultimately, Isaiah was forced out of Alabama anyway. The freedom Elizabeth had fought for him to have was taken away by a state that couldn't tolerate successful, free black people, that saw them as threats to the slave system's ideological justifications. Was what Elizabeth did reward for Isaiah's service? Or was it inadequate compensation for 13 years of enslavement, followed by 8 years of underpaid labor, managing a plantation that profited from others' enslavement? The answer is probably both. Elizabeth gave Isaiah something valuable: freedom, wages, resources to restart his life. But she couldn't give him justice, couldn't undo the years of enslavement, couldn't create real equality within a system built on inequality. The relationship between Elizabeth and Isaiah, whatever its exact nature, was impossible in the world they inhabited. Southern society couldn't tolerate a white widow and a black man treating each other as intellectual equals, showing mutual respect, developing genuine connection. The fact that their relationship appears to have been entirely proper by conventional standards, no evidence of sexual impropriety, nothing beyond professional collaboration and personal friendship, didn't matter. The appearance of equality was itself transgressive. This is perhaps slavery's most insidious aspect. It didn't just enslave black people's bodies, it tried to enslave everyone's hearts and minds. It demanded that white people deny black humanity, that they maintain emotional distance, that they never acknowledge the fundamental wrongness of the system. Elizabeth's crime, in the eyes of her society, wasn't anything she actually did wrong. It was that she saw Isaiah as fully human, treated him accordingly, and refused to pretend otherwise, even when it cost her socially. Remember this story. Remember that it happened in 1841 in Alabama, involving people trying to navigate an immoral system that gave them limited options. Remember that Elizabeth freed Isaiah when she didn't have to, then fought to let him stay in Alabama and build a life. Remember that the court blocked her attempt to give him real economic security, showing how the system prevented even willing white people from creating racial equality. Remember that Isaiah was forced out of Alabama despite his freedom, despite his property, despite everything Elizabeth had done for him. That freedom under slavery's shadow was always contingent, always vulnerable to laws designed to maintain white supremacy. Remember that this story has no heroes, only people trapped in an evil system, making choices that were never good, only less terrible. The widow and her most trusted slave. A forbidden reward that was both generous and inadequate, meaningful and insufficient. An attempt at recognition that couldn't escape the system's fundamental evil. It's part of our history. Complicated, uncomfortable, refusing simple moral categories. Remember it, all of it. What do you think about Elizabeth Hartwell's actions? Was she generous for freeing Isaiah and trying to give him land? Or was she merely doing the minimum to assuage guilt for participating in slavery? Was their relationship one of genuine respect and connection? Or was it fundamentally corrupted by the owner-slave dynamic that preceded Isaiah's freedom? Can we celebrate Elizabeth's actions while condemning the system she participated in? These questions don't have comfortable answers. Elizabeth freed one person, while keeping 74 others enslaved. She tried to reward Isaiah, but couldn't escape the system that had exploited him for 13 years. She treated him with respect, but within a framework that denied his basic humanity. Was this better than other slaveholders? Obviously. But does being better than other participants in an evil system deserve praise, or just recognition as slightly less culpable? Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives that resist simple moral categorization. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, acknowledging that the past contains situations modern moral frameworks struggle to address. This story forces us to confront how people navigated slavery's moral compromises, how even good intentions couldn't escape the system's fundamental evil, and how laws prevented racial equality even when individuals tried to create it. See you in the next video.